White House ghosts. It is said that Lincoln's ghost haunts the White House. He appears in the room where the Lincoln bed is kept. Harry Truman once responded to a 3 o'clock knock on his door and found no one there. He attributed the knock to Lincoln. Lincoln is said to return to the White House when the security of the country is at risk. He strides up and down the second-floor hallway, raps at doors, and stands by certain windows with his hands clasped behind his back. One staff member claimed to have seen Lincoln sitting on his bed pulling on his boots. A bodyguard to President Harrison was kept awake many nights trying to protect the president from mysterious footsteps he heard in the hall. He grew so tired and worried, he finally attended a seance to beg President Lincoln to stop so he could get enough sleep to properly protect the president. Abigail Adams' ghost was seen drifting through the closed doors of the East Room to hang the laundry during the Taft administration. A gardener claims to have spoken to the ghost of Dolly Madison, who reproved him for trying to remove the rose bushes she had planted over 100 years ago. In the 1930s, Andrew Jackson's ghost could be heard laughing in the Rose Room. In 1952, extensive repairs were done to the second floor of the White House. Since then, the ghosts have not walked so actively. White Riders. They were not even close to the main camp when the sandstorm storm hit, blasting hot sand into their eyes, hair, and skin. The windworld above, around, and under the hasty shelter the two cowboys had set up, offering no protection at all. They took small sips of water every hour or so to relieve the dryness of their throats and to shift about to keep from being buried completely under the sand. A day passed in these terrible conditions. The two cowboys drank the last of their water and ate the last of their food, while the wind and sand whipped about in an impenetrable curtain and the heat dried out their bodies. One after the other, their horses dropped dead and were gradually buried under the sand. Through his increasing misery, one of the men noticed that the sound of the storm was muted, though there was no decrease in the pounding of the wind and the sand. Through the sandstorm rode a man dressed all in white. He was followed by 11 riders, who were also dressed in white. Their spurs, bits, and stirrups gleamed like silver, their belt buckles were gold. They were leading a white horse behind them. He tried to call out to them, but his lips were swollen shut. The procession stopped in front of the half-buried cowboys and two men dismounted. They walked over to the man beside him. Tenderly, they helped the other cowboy over to the riderless horse and set him in the saddle. Then they mounted their horses and the men in white started riding away. The remaining cowboy pried his lips apart with shaking fingers and gave a hoarse cry of protest. But the white riders disappeared back into the storm, leaving him alone in the whipping sand. Just before the last rider vanished, he turned back towards the cowboy and said, "It is not your time yet. We will come back for you presently." Then he passed out of sight. Stricken, the cowboy buried his face against his arm and gradually lost consciousness. He was awakened by someone shaking his shoulder. He looked up into the eyes of some of his fellow cowpokes who had come to find him and his friend as soon as the storm let up. They forced some water through his dry lips and helped him sit up and told him he was lucky to survive. Something in their grim air made him turn to look at his friend, who lay dead at his side. His heart beat rapidly as he realized suddenly how narrow his own escape had been. And suddenly he understood something else. The riders he had seen had been the White Riders of Death. By leaving him behind, they had spared his life when they came through the storm to take his friend home. Who calls? By the time he finished his daily tasks, the light was failing. But everything he needed to accomplish before he made the journey to visit his betrothed was complete. He was eager to see his love, so he set out immediately, in spite of the growing darkness. He would paddle his canoe through the night and be with his beloved come the dawn. The river sang softly to itself under the clear night sky. He glanced up through the trees, identifying certain favorite stars and chanting softly to himself, his thoughts all of her. Suddenly, he heard his name called out. He jerked back to awareness, halting his paddling and allowing the canoe to drift as he searched for the speaker. "Who calls?" he asked in his native tongue, and then repeated the words in French, "Quapel?" There was no response. Deciding that he had imagined the incident, he took up his paddle and continued down the dark, murmuring rivers. A few moments later, he heard his name spoken again. It came from everywhere and from nowhere, and something about the sound reminded him of his beloved. But of course, she could not be here in this empty place along the river. She was at home with her family. "Who calls?" he asked in his native tongue, and then repeated the words in French, "Quapel?" His words echoed back to him from the surrounding valley, echoing and reverberating. The sound faded away and he listened intently, but there was no response. The breeze swirled around him, touching his hair and his face. For a moment, the touch was that of his beloved, his fair one, and he closed his eyes and breathed deep of the perfumed air. Almost, he thought he heard her voice in his ear, whispering his name. Then the breeze died away, and he took up his paddle and continued his journey to the home of his love. He arrived at dawn and was met by his beloved's father. One look at the old warrior's face told him what had happened. His beloved, his fair one, was gone. She had died during the night while he was journeying to her side. Her last words had been his name, uttered twice, just before she breathed her last. He fell on his knees, weeping like a small child. Around him, the wind rose softly and swirled through his hair, across his cheek, as gentle as a touch. In his memory, he heard his beloved's voice, calling to him in the night. Finally, he rose, took the old warrior's arm and helped him back to his home. To this day, travelers on the Quapel River can still hear the echo of the Cree warrior's voice as he reaches out to the spirit of his beloved, crying, "Quapel? Who calls? Wendigo." The storm lasted so long that they thought they would starve. Finally, when the wind and swirling snow had died away to just a memory, the father, who was a brave warrior, ventured outside. The next storm was already on the horizon, but if food was not found soon, the family would starve. Keeping his knife and spear close, he ventured out upon the most frequently used game trail, watching intently for some sign in the newly fallen snow of animal footprints or movement of any kind. The forest lay deep and oddly silent under its gleaming coating of ice and snow. Every creature of sense lay deep within its burrow and slept. Still, the warrior hunted, knowing how desperate his family had become. As he moved through the eerie stillness, broken only by the soft caress of the wind, he heard a strange hissing noise. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The warrior stopped, his heart pounding. That was when he saw the blood-soaked footprints appearing on the path in front of him. He gripped his knife tightly, knowing that somewhere, watching him, was a Wendigo. He had learned about the Wendigo at his father's knee. It was a large creature, as tall as a tree, with a lipless mouth and jagged teeth. Its breath was a strange hiss, its footprints full of blood, and it ate any man, woman, or child who ventured into its territory. And those were the lucky ones. Sometimes, the Wendigo chose to possess a person instead, and then the luckless individual became a Wendigo himself, hunting down those he had once loved and feasting upon their flesh. The warrior knew he would have just one chance to prevail over the Wendigo. After that, he would die. Or, the thought was too terrible to complete. Slowly, he backed away from the bloody footprints, listening to the hissing sound. Was it stronger in one direction? He gripped spear in one hand, knife in the other. Then the snowbank to his left erupted as a creature as tall as a tree leapt out at him. He dove to one side, rolling into the snow so that his clothing was covered and he became hard to see in the gray twilight of the approaching storm. The Wendigo whirled its massive frame and the warrior threw the spear. It struck the creature's chest, but the Wendigo just shook it off as if it were a toy. The warrior crouched behind a small tree as the creature searched the torn-up snow for a trace of him. Perhaps one more chance. The Wendigo loomed over his hiding place, its sharp eyes seeing the outline of him against the tree. It bent down, long arms reaching. The warrior leapt forward as if to embrace the creature and thrust his knife into its fathomless black eye. The Wendigo howled in pain as the blade of the knife sliced into its brain cavity. It tried to pull him off of its chest, but the warrior clung to the creature, stabbing it again and again in the eyes, the head. The Wendigo collapsed to the ground, bleeding profusely, almost crushing the warrior beneath its bulk. He pulled himself loose and stared at the creature, which blended in with its white surroundings so well that he would not have seen it save for the blood pouring from its eyes and ears and scalp. Then the outline of the creature grew misty and it vanished, leaving only a pool of blood to indicate where it had fallen. Shaken, the warrior, heart pounding with fear and fatigue, turned for home. He was weakened by lack of food, but knew that the storm would break soon and he would die if he did not seek shelter. At the edge of the wood, he found himself face to face with a red fox. It was a fat old creature, its muzzle lined with gray. The creature stood still, as if it had been brought to him as a reward for killing the Wendigo. With a prayer of thanksgiving, the warrior killed the fox and took it home to his starving family. The meat lasted for many days, until the final storm had blown itself out and the warrior could safely hunt once more. Yancey's Ghost. Yancey was a quirky old-time pioneer, gold prospector, and Civil War veteran, perhaps the last of that breed who came to Yellowstone National Park in the 1870s and built a hotel in Yancey's Hole, current-day Pleasant Valley near Roosevelt Lodge. The hotel provided accommodations and provisions to the stagecoach traveling back and forth between Mammoth Hot Springs and the mining camps in Cook City. It boasted 5 bedrooms and could accommodate 20 guests. Rooms were $2 per day, $10 per week, and included meals. There was also a saloon handy for anyone wishing a splash of moonshine after dinner. Folks around Yellowstone called him Uncle John Yancey. He was popular with just about everybody in the park and its vicinity. Uncle John Yancey had important friends among the posh families back east, some of whom dropped by the hotel from time to time. Yancey knew all the good fishing holes and had plenty of tall tales to amuse people. He welcomed all and sundry with a libation of Kentucky tea, reputed to be the best whiskey in the park. John F. Yancey was 77 years when he traveled to Gardner, Montana, to witness the dedication of the Roosevelt Arch by President Theodore Roosevelt on April 24, 1903. Yancey met President Roosevelt during the ceremony, but he caught a cold at the event and died of pneumonia a couple of weeks later. He was buried in the Old Tinkers Cemetery near Mammoth, and folks thought that was the last they'd ever see of Yancey. But not so. It soon became apparent that Yancey's had gone right back to the Pleasant Valley, and Yancey's ghost made himself at home in Roosevelt Lodge for the next 100+ years. According to the park employees, Yancey's ghost will bang a tin cup on the walls of the staff quarters at 3 a.m. He hides things and makes them reappear in unexpected places. Yancey's ghost has also been known to unsaddle horse, especially those of pretty girl wranglers, at the end of a long day on the trail. A trickster and a bit of a nuisance, Yancey's ghost is still as wild as the West he helped tame. Yellow ribbon. Jane wore a yellow ribbon around her neck every day. And I mean every day, rain or shine, whether it matched her outfit or not. It annoyed her best friend Johnny after a while. He was her next-door neighbor and had known Jane since she was 3. When he was young, he had barely noticed the yellow ribbon, but now they were in high school together, it bothered him. "Why do you wear the yellow ribbon around your neck, Jane?" he'd ask her every day. But she wouldn't tell him. Still, in spite of this aggravation, Johnny thought she was cute. He asked her to the soda shop for an ice cream sundae. Then he asked her to watch him playing in the football game. Then he started seeing her home. And come this spring, he asked her to the dance. Jane always said yes when he asked her out. And she always wore a yellow dress to match the ribbon around her neck. It finally occurred to Johnny that he and Jane were going steady, and he still didn't know why she wore the yellow ribbon around her neck. So he asked her about it yet again, and yet again she did not tell him. "Maybe someday I'll tell you about it," she'd reply. "Someday." That answer annoyed Johnny, but he shrugged it off, because Jane was so cute and fun to be with. Well, time flew past, as it has a habit of doing, and one day Johnny proposed to Jane and was accepted. They planned a big wedding, and Jane hinted that she might tell him about the yellow ribbon around her neck on their wedding day. But somehow, what with the preparations and his beautiful bride, and the lovely reception, Johnny never got around to asking Jane about it. And when he did remember, she got a bit teary-eyed and said, "We are so happy together, what difference does it make?" And Johnny decided she was right. Johnny and Jane raised a family of 4, with the usual ups and downs, laughter and tears. When their golden anniversary rolled around, Johnny once again asked Jane about the yellow ribbon around her neck. It was the first time he brought it up since the week after their wedding. Whenever their children asked him about it, he always hushed them, and somehow none of the kids had dared ask their mother. Jane gave Johnny a sad look and said, "Johnny, you've waited this long. You can wait a while longer." And Johnny agreed. It was not until Jane was on her deathbed a year later that Johnny, seeing his last chance slip away, asked Jane one final time about the yellow ribbon she wore around her neck. She shook her head a bit at his persistence, and then said with a sad smile, "Okay, Johnny, you can go ahead and untie it." With shaking hands, Johnny fumbled for the knot and untied the yellow ribbon around his wife's neck. And Jane's head fell off. You can't get out. One dark, windy night, the town drunk was meandering his way home after the bar closed. Somehow he got turned around and ended up walking through the churchyard instead of taking the road home. The wind picked up and he thought he could hear a voice calling his name. Suddenly, the ground opened up in front of him and he fell down into an open grave. He could hear the voice clearer now, calling to him. He knew it was the devil, coming for him just like the preacher said, on account of him being the town drunk. The hole was very deep and inside it was pitch black. His eyes adjusted to the darkness after a few moments and he made out a form sitting in the darkness with him. It called his name and he scrambled away in fear, trying to climb out of that terrible grave. Then the figure spoke. "You can't get out," it said. The drunk gave a shout of pure terror and leapt straight up more than 6 feet. He caught the edge of the hole in his hands, scrambled out, and ran for home as fast as he could go. Inside the open grave, his neighbor Charlie sighed in resignation. He'd fallen into the hole a few minutes before his friend and had thought that together they might help each other climb out. Now he was going to have to wait until morning and get the mortician to bring him a ladder.